Welcome to Tracing Paint. We're going to visit the studio where the painters Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner worked. When you are ready to begin the experience, point your controller toward the footprints on the floor. Press the trigger button on your controller with your index finger to start. Nice work. You've just learned how to teleport. You'll be able to move to different points of interest in the artist's studios using this method. Now, let's begin. Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner were abstract expressionist artists. Their dramatically new approach to painting revolutionized modern art in the mid-20th century. They were action painters, using spontaneous, improvisational techniques to create dynamic, abstract imagery. Soon after they married in 1945, they left New York City to be able to focus more on their work. They moved to Springs, a rural community on Long Island about 100 miles east of the city. They converted the barn on their property into a studio. In this space, only 21 feet square, they created their most famous works of art. Pollock used the studio from 1946 until his death in 1956. Krasner worked here from 1957 through 1982. Today, trees have grown up behind the barn. Let's go back in time to see the studio as it looked when Pollock and Krasner were actually working here. You'll be hearing from the artists themselves and from the art critics who wrote about their work. Now you're in Jackson Pollock's studio. Feel free to explore the space by pointing your controller to where you want to go and pressing the trigger button with your index finger. When Pollock first began painting here, the walls and floor were just bare wood. There was neither heat nor electricity. But by then, after years of experimentation, he had perfected his singular method of applying fluid pigments without actually touching the painting surface. He produced his richly layered all-over compositions using the sticks, hardened brushes, and basting syringes you can see in the paint cans nearby. The film excerpt you're about to see shows him at work, and you'll hear Pollock himself describe his process.
Having the canvas on the floor, I feel nearer, more a part of the painting. This way I can walk around it, work from all four sides, and be in the painting. Sometimes I use a brush, but often prefer using a stick. Sometimes I pour the paint straight out of the can.
Hello, I'm Helen Harrison, director of the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center. Here in the studio, you can see evidence that Pollock's sweeping gestures often extended beyond the canvas, leaving colorful marks on the floor. If you know where to look, you can locate exactly where certain paintings were made. Jump to the footprints that just appeared and look down at the floor. This is where he painted Galaxy in 1947. Most of Pollock's paintings are small to medium size, like Galaxy. The title may be a reference to the myriad of stars he could see in the night sky outside his rural home. It's one of his earliest all-over poured paintings, but it started life as a more conventional composition of pictographic forms. The 1947 painting you see here is an overlay of silvery aluminum paint textured with sand and accented with creamy white, green, yellow, and blue. You can move around to look at the painting from all sides, but your starting point will be at the bottom, as you can tell by locating the artist's signature. In this case, it's at the lower right.
The paintings of Jackson Pollock, which have been called untalented and likened to baked macaroni in view and to an explosion in a shingle mill in the New York Times, have been in at least 3 paintings I have seen. both masterful and miraculous. Manny Farber, writing for the New Republic, 1945.
The thing that interests me is that today painters do not have to go to a subject matter outside of themselves. Most modern painters work from a different source. They work from within.
By 1950, when he painted this work, Pollock had stopped giving his paintings titles. He thought numbers were neutral, allowing viewers to decide for themselves how to interpret the imagery. He used house paint not to save money, but to get the effects he was after, the long flowing lines that captured his creative energy.
I think they should not look for, but look passively, and try to receive what the painting has to offer, and not bring a subject matter or preconceived idea of what they're to be looking for.
Pollock uses no brush, but lays his canvas on the floor and trickles the fluid paint on it from above, his hand weaving the thin stream of color into a rhythmic, variegated labyrinth. The result provides an energetic adventure for the eyes, a Luna Park full of fireworks, pitfalls, surprises, and delights. Alfred Barr, writing for Art News, 1950.
My feeling is that new needs need new technique, and the modern artist has found new ways and new means of making his statement. It seems to me that the modern painter cannot express this age, the airplane, the atom bomb, the radio, and the old forms of the Renaissance, or of any other past culture. Each age finds its own technique.
In the case of Blue Poles, Pollock re-entered it, as he put it, many times, spending some 6 months on it. Most of the work was done with it lying on the floor, but he also tacked the canvas to the wall and applied some paint there, as you can tell from the white streaks running down the surface. Over time, layer after colorful layer was added, but Pollock couldn't seem to resolve it. Then he got the idea to use a piece of lumber, a 2x4, to apply 8 vertical strips of ultramarine blue paint, the so-called blue poles of the title, which helped structure and unify the composition.
Pollock often sits for hours in deep contemplation of work in progress, his face forming rigid lines and often settling in a heavy frown. A Pollock painting is not born easily, but comes into being after weeks, often months of work and thought. At times he paints with feverish activity, or again with slow deliberation. Robert Goodenow, writing for Art News, 1951.
Sometimes I lose a painting, but I have no fear of changes, of destroying the image. Because a painting has a life of its own, I try to let it live.
In 1953, Pollock had the drafty, unheated studio renovated. The walls and ceiling were insulated and covered with wallboard. The floor was covered with masonite, and the whole interior was painted white. Fluorescent lights and heat were added, too. This meant for the first time he could work here at night and in the winter. While Pollock used the barn studio, Lee Krasner used an upstairs bedroom in their house. Then, in 1956, Pollock died in a car crash near their home. Krasner was in Paris at the time and came back grief-stricken. This photo was taken in her upstairs studio 3 weeks after Pollock's death. A year later, in 1957, she moved into the barn studio. Here, Lee had the space to paint mural-sized canvases and develop the subjective, nature-inspired imagery for which she became renowned. Her energy often propelled the paint beyond the edges of the canvas, as you can see where she painted this untitled work in 1963.
Untitled Red is a medium-sized canvas filled with twisting, curling forms, some of them created by squeezing crimson paint directly from the tube. Krasner had recently broken the arm she painted with, so she used restrained gestures to create lively shapes that often spilled out onto the surrounding wall. Here's how she described her use of color.
With my awareness of intense color, or wanting or needing to use it that way, it dictates what takes place on the canvas, so that I don't say I'm going to have a large sweep of orange here. As the painting evolves, this thing begins, the need for the painting requires that.
Krasner's all-over patterning is not uniform or literally repetitive. It is linked to the forms found in nature, which are similar but not identical, altering when they repeat. Barbara Rose, author of Lee Krasner, 1983.
Krasner began her paintings without preconceptions and only gave them titles after she finished them. For Gaia, she wasn't trying to depict the Greek goddess of the earth literally. Instead, she expressed the explosive life force personified by the goddess, a force that propelled the paint beyond the canvas edges.
I start with a blank, and there's nothing more horrifying than a blank canvas, because I don't have a thought or an idea, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that. Then finally something stimulates you to move. It may be an obsession with a color. I will start and make some brush strokes across the entire canvas, and then pretty soon some image will suggest itself to me. And by image, I don't mean a naturalistic image, but some form will, and I start out from that, and then I keep moving with it.
The images reflect the artist's preoccupation with nature, in a broad sense, as a cycle of life that combines specific objects like leaves, flowers, vegetable, animal, mineral, shell, and seed forms within a generalized cosmos. Brown Robertson, writing for Art in America, 1973.
Like Gaia, Portrait in Green suggests its imagery abstractly and can be interpreted in various ways. The turbulent composition revolves around an ovoid shape that can be read as a schematic face, or the so-called portrait may symbolize an inner state of being. Perhaps Krasner used looping arabesques and verdant coloring to communicate the intangible feelings that both she and Pollock considered to be the true subject matter of their art.
The swinging arcs of color in these works, clearly based on nature, all but overflow the confines of her large canvases. Eleanor Monroe, from her book Originals, American Women Artists, 1979.
There's nothing that I can think of, including spirit, that I conceive away from nature. In other words, I cannot conceive anything outside of nature. Growth is part of it. Change is constant. I do not feel I can separate myself from nature. I'm at ease when I'm approaching a canvas to have it within my physical scope, including jumping up, maybe to hit the top of the canvas. What I don't want to do is get up on a ladder and hit the top. I want it to be within my body experience. I want to be in contact with my body and the work.
You're now in the studio as it looks today. After Lee Krasner's death in 1984, their house and studio were opened to the public as the Pollock Krasner House and Study Center. under the auspices of the Stony Brook Foundation. In the studio, the 1953 floor covering was removed to reveal Pollock's colors and gestures, while Krasner's marks remain on the walls. The building contains evidence of both artists' masterpieces of abstract painting. Their works now live in public and private collections all around the world. Galaxy is in the Joslin Art Museum, Omaha, Nebraska. Number 3, 1950, is in the St. Louis Art Museum, St. Louis, Missouri. Blue Poles, number 11, 1952, is in the National Gallery of Australia, Canberra. Untitled Red is in Guildhall Museum, East Hampton, New York. Gaia is in the Museum of Modern Art, New York. Portrait in Green is in the collection of the Pollock-Krasner Foundation, New York.